Хорошо.
The 7,785th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Andorra, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Canada, Costa Rica, Croatia, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Georgia, Germany, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Mexico, Monaco, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Qatar, Romania, San Marino, Saudi Arabia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Sweden, Turkey, and the Syrian Arab Republic, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them documents S/2016/846 and S/2016/847, which contain the texts of 2 draft resolutions, respectively. I now give the floor to members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jean-Marc Ayrault, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Development of France. Please.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the face of the unbearable horror of martyrized Aleppo, the Security Council once again faces the responsibility that the international community has given to it. That is to ensure peace and to ensure international security and to protect civilian populations. Yesterday, we heard the Special Envoy of the United Nations, Staffan de Mistura. His description sounds like a cry of alarm. Now, if this continues, we will have witnessed, by the end of this year, the destruction of Aleppo. The message that Staffan de Mistura sends to the Security Council is unambiguous. If we don't do something, this town will soon just be in ruins and will remain in history as a town in which the inhabitants were abandoned to their executioners. 2 weeks ago at this Security Council, I asked on behalf of France for an immediate ceasefire. Since then, following a stillborn agreement, the Syrian regime has confirmed with unheard-of brutality what its target is. And that has nothing to do with combating terrorism. The goal is to have the capitulation of Aleppo. Daraya, Hama, Aleppo. Each time the Syrian regime's tactic remains unchanged. Indiscriminate bombings, the methodical destruction of civilian infrastructures to ensure that civilian populations suffer. And recently, even drinking water in Aleppo has been interrupted. The targeting of hospitals and health professionals. And each time, those who support Damascus bring a decisive support to this strategy, which has only one goal, and that is to ensure the surrender of the fighters, an exodus of civilians in operations which could lead to a possible ethnic cleansing of a disastrous nature. So how, together, can we tolerate all this? The Secretary General of the United Nations has spoken of war crimes. We all remember Guernica, Srebrenica, and Grozny. What we are seeing in Aleppo is the horrendous repetition of those tragedies. And if the international community does not wake up, it will share the responsibility. The regime and its supporters claim to be acting in the context of combating terrorism. This is totally false, and I strongly condemn it. Bashar al-Assad is not combating terrorism, he's fueling it. Since the beginning of this conflict, the first and foremost target was the moderate opposition because it embodies the only hope of one day having a united and peaceful Syria. He's organizing a deadly toe-to-toe between him on the one hand and Daesh and Al-Qaeda on the other, and he is deliberately spurring his allies. France has paid the price of terrorism. We cannot accept that this vital battle, which should bring us all together, should be misused in this way through punitive actions, which at the end of the day, it only fuels that which it's claiming to eliminate. Because when you destroy hospitals, starve civilians, and massacre women and children, when you besiege cities, as in the Middle Ages, only leads to radicalization and further fuels terrorism. So a stop must be made to this infernal cycle, and it's a matter of urgency. Now, in the face of this horror, the Security Council must take a very straightforward and clear decision. It must demand immediate action in order to save Aleppo. It must demand an end to all the bombings by the regime and its allies. It must demand that humanitarian aid arrive without any obstacle and without any conditions to a population which desperately needs it. This is what the situation in Aleppo calls for. And this is what France, with the majority of the members of the Security Council, has been promoting. A week ago, together with Spain, we submitted a draft resolution, a straightforward draft, which meets this urgent requirement. And what does the text of this resolution say? It restates the obvious, the unacceptable nature of the blind repression undertaken by the Syrian regime against its own people. It recalls all the decisions taken by our Council since the beginning of this crisis. It lists the conditions for a fair and lasting peace and a political solution, which we outlined a long time ago. And it expresses a desire for unity around this goal which should bring us all together, that is combating terrorism. This draft also sets out clear and specific demands, the immediate halt to the bombardments and military flights over Aleppo, access for humanitarian assistance, the respect for the ceasefire guaranteed by an effective verification mechanism, whose modalities are still to be defined, the end of any support or collaboration with listed terrorist groups, as listed by the Security Council, and the resumption of the political process. Some wish to have preconditions for an ending of the bombings, and that is specific localization of the terrorists and the separation of these groups. This is raising the stakes because it cannot be achieved once the bombings continue. And this is absolutely clear. Destroying a town by bombs and massacring civilians only fuels terrorism. It doesn't combat it. Allow me to repeat it. What is really urgent is the end of the bombings. This is the only worthwhile precondition, because it is a precondition for all the rest. This draft resolution has been patiently negotiated in good faith with the aim to bring together the international community around a straightforward goal. The legitimate preoccupations of all parties have been taken into account, and it's with an open heart and with an outstretched hand that I personally have striven to create over the recent days and recent hours the conditions for a consensus in a totally sincere way and without any hidden agenda. The only desire has been to favor the return of peace in Syria, put an end to the martyrdom of an entire people, and to promote a solution to the tragedy being lived by millions of refugees and displaced persons. It is my feeling that the overwhelming majority of members of this Council understand and approve this approach. Now, the adoption of this resolution can give to the people in Aleppo and to the Syrian people and to us all a hope, a new hope, the hope to emerge from the spiral of violence, the hope of a new political dynamism based on an urgent resumption of negotiations with a view to a transition. And the Security Council has already outlined this in a unanimous way more than a year ago. Now, if, on the contrary, our draft, despite a broad support, is rejected, what will remain? There will be more dead, more refugees, more displaced persons. But we must not give up. We mustn't give up or accept this situation. It will be for each of us to draw the consequences and to take serious decisions, but necessary ones, so that those who are committing war crimes do not remain unpunished, for those who have used chemical weapons be identified and punished, and those who are accomplices to a regime that is worn out assume the consequences, and that all work together and take action. Mr. President, in 2011, an entire people peacefully rose up against oppression, and for 5 years, despite savage repression, this people is not giving up. This people, which has lived through trials and suffering, do not leave them with just one choice, that is between an executioner and the terrorism of ISIL and Nusra. I call upon every member of the Security Council to assume their responsibilities, save the population of Aleppo, come together for peace, and send to the Syrian regime a message that they should have heard a long time ago. What is at stake today is first and foremost the fate of Aleppo and its people. But it's more than that. It's the hope of establishing at last an end to a conflict for which we are all of us, paying the catastrophic consequences. In the face of such a situation, to be an obstacle to the adoption of this resolution would be to give Bashar al-Assad the possibility of killing even more. It would be also a senseless gift to the terrorists. So my wish is that this Security Council should not give them this gift. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. I'd now like to give the floor to the representative of Spain.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Spain has, together with Spain, promoted this draft resolution on Aleppo to try to respond to a desperate situation. Over more than 5 years of a conflict in Syria, we have been witnesses to indiscriminate attacks against civilians. We have seen on both sides the destruction of hospitals, schools, including humanitarian convoys. We are seeing the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian army. And nevertheless, we are meeting today again because the worst episode of this war in Syria could still be ahead of us. The regime's offensive against eastern Aleppo is a tragedy, and the international community cannot close its eyes to this. Mr. President, this draft resolution seeks, as has said by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe. And therefore we demand that there be an end to the aerial bombings which are attacking 150,000 civilians who are trapped in the eastern part of the city. The main target of this resolution is to save from disaster a 1,000-year-old town which is running the risk of a fratricide war destroying all. Now, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the government of Spain, José Manuel García, said very clearly what is our position in the Security Council when the escalation in the fighting began at the end of September. He also pointed out important areas in which we should concentrate our efforts. Now, the first is to ensure a ceasefire. The second is to ensure humanitarian access. And the third is to create the necessary conditions to ensure the resumption of UN mediation. Now, the draft resolution calls indeed for the immediate resumption of the ceasefire throughout the country. And we propose also an improvement in the supervision mechanism, which has not functioned as it would have been desirable for it to have functioned over recent months. We call upon the Security Council for the first time since the Syrian war began that it should send a clear message to the parties to isolate terrorist groups who, from Syria, are a threat to the entire international community. Secondly, we hope that for once and all the humanitarian assistance will be in the hands of UN professionals and the Red Crescent. It's intolerable that the Syrian government continues to blockade any assistance getting to its own people with fictitious red tape and deliberate tactics, such as the removal of medical assistance. This is a war crime, and for that reason the draft resolution establishes that it's the United Nations should determine how many beneficiaries of the humanitarian aid and what the nearly 90,000 civilians who are besieged in Syria require. We also call for investigations into the attack on the UN humanitarian convoy and the Red Crescent on the 19th of September last. We will remain tireless while everything is done to ensure that the guilty are brought to justice. Wherever they may be, we do hope that they are listening clearly to this message today, which is sent by all members of the Security Council. And finally, the draft resolution calls for, as soon as possible, the path of dialogue, and we express our total support to the Special Envoy of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Mr. President, France and Spain have done everything that they could to achieve the support of the 15 members of the Security Council. These have been a sincere attempt to incorporate the various viewpoints and always respecting the principal goal of the resolution, which is that we want to avoid the catastrophe in Aleppo and prevent an escalation of the violence. We note that we are close to consensus. We do still hope that those countries seated around this table will allow for the adoption of this draft resolution. We still have time to take the right decision. Finally, Mr. President, Spain would like to express its appreciation to the numerous member states of the United Nations who co-sponsor this draft resolution. And we interpret this support as a message for the Security Council to meet the responsibility that it has under the Charter of the United Nations. From the seat that we occupy as a non-permanent member of this body, we will work tirelessly for this to happen. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Spain for that statement. And now, I should like to make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Russian Federation. Colleagues, today we're participating in one of the strangest spectacles in the history of the Security Council. We have to vote on 2 draft resolutions of the Council, while we are all well aware that neither will be adopted. Given that the crisis in Syria is at a critical stage, when it's particularly important that there be a coordination of the political efforts of the international community, this waste of time is inadmissible. The backstory of the Syrian crisis is well known. After destroying Libya and proclaiming this a big success, the Western Troika of Security Council permanent members set their sights on Syria. To a great regret, Paris, which in 2003 with Moscow and other reasonable capitals attempted to warn the US and the UK against reckless incursion in Iraq, this time has become one of the loudest proponents of the hastily put together change regime policy in Damascus. We note with regret that over the years of the Syrian crisis, the French delegation on the Security Council has put forth not a single constructive thing. Their rare initiatives clearly were counting on an effective propaganda and doomed to fail. This is what happened this time too. And just about a week ago, our French colleagues contacted us and told us that they'd like to circulate a draft resolution to the Security Council on Syria, while underscoring that Paris would like to avoid a Russian veto. Reaffirmations about trying to avoid the Russian veto were given at a higher level on 6 October. But a day later, after just one round of serious consultations, the draft was put in blue and put to a vote, doomed to be vetoed by Russia. This is something we stated many times, and emphatically so. We note that Spain has proclaimed its co-sponsorship of the resolution. Russia invited Spain to become part of the ISSG. The actions of Spanish diplomacy have been disappointing. A feature of the French-Spanish draft is a prohibition or ban on all military flights on Aleppo, not just on the east, but on the western part of the city too, which is continually shelled by fighters from the east. Just in September, according to UN agencies, more than 80 civilians were killed, 170 wounded. The concept of the ban on all military flights is totally not fleshed out. We asked, does this mean that intel drones can't fly either, which are following the movement of fighters? There's no answer. The west part of the city is covered as well. This is controlled by the government, and we were told that that's because this is more convenient. Is this credible? Yet another matter of principle. In this history of the Security Council, there's been no case when a permanent member of the Council allowed for a resolution to be adopted which directly or indirectly determined its course of action without preliminary agreement. I think such cases won't occur in the future either, unless France, renouncing its right to veto, will manage the majority of Security Council members. Any limitations could be seen in the context, only in the context, of compliance with the ceasefire regime, which terrorists and other militia continually violate. Another huge gap in the French-Spanish proposal is that instead of the monitoring mechanism from the ISSG and approved by Security Council Resolution 2268, instead a sort of air-spun duplication scheme is being proposed. We think this is an attempt to violate the existing architecture for cooperation. In this context, we took an unusual step. Yesterday, in the afternoon, we provided a draft resolution, which should show that there was a reasonable course for collective action, drawing upon the positives, which had been built with such difficulty earlier. Our draft contains provisions referring to the relevant parameters of the Russian-US agreement of 9 September. It also underscores the importance of ensuring swift and unhampered humanitarian access, in particular through the 48-hour humanitarian pauses daily. This is what's being presented in the draft resolution, as well as provisions on the need to comply with the ceasefire regime in Aleppo by all sides. There's affirmation of the existing monitoring arrangement in cooperation with ISSG mechanism for the ceasefire. The fundamental priority of separating the moderate opposition from Jabhat al-Nusra is set out. The ISSG are called upon to appeal to sides to stop cooperating militarily with terrorists, to separate from them, and officially join the ceasefire regime. Reference is made to the fact that to achieve progress on the humanitarian track, there's a need to ensure that fighters de-block movement on the Castello Road in line with the arrangements in 9 September's agreement. There's also reference to the initiative of the SRSG Staffan de Mistura from 6 October to bring normalcy to the situation in Aleppo. The SG is called upon to provide a detailed plan for implementation and approval by the Security Council. Unfortunately, Mr. de Mistura's plan is totally ignored in the French-Spanish draft, which is yet another huge gap in it. There is an imperative for utmost compliance with Security Council Resolution 2254, fully and on all tracks, the political, humanitarian, and counterterrorism ones. We continue to be guided by the idea that progress on these tracks has to happen in a parallel manner without artificial linkages or preconditions. There needs to be a relaunching of the inter-Syrian political process, which since May has been blocked by the radical opposition, with total permissiveness from its outside sponsors. We understand that our draft won't garner the necessary number of votes today. Somebody will be guided by an anti-Russian attitude, and some have instead a wrong impression of what prestige really is, and these people are lacking courage. We stand ready to continue to cooperate to find a solution to the situation in Syria with all interested international and regional partners. Indeed, the military activity fighters in eastern Aleppo is going down. Yesterday, for an example, there were hardly any cases. We hope that this is a trend that will continue. Thank you, colleagues. I now take back up my functions as President of the Council.
Как я понимаю,
It is my understanding that the Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I shall first put to vote the draft resolution contained in document S/2016/846. Submitted by Andorra, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Canada, Costa Rica, Croatia, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, and Luxembourg, Malta, Mexico, Monaco, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Qatar, Romania, San Marino, Saudi Arabia, Senegal, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Turkey, Ukraine, the United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2016/846 please raise their hand?
кто против?
Those against?
Кто воздержал?
Abstentions.
Где ж он не принят? А где ж он не принят? Результаты голосования.
The result of the voting is as follows. 11 in favor, 2 against, 2 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted, as permanent council members have voted against it.
Сейчас я предоставляю.
I now give the floor to those members of the council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the UK.
Normally, I begin my statements in this council with the words, "Thank you, Mr. President." I cannot do that today. Because today, we have seen the 5th veto in 5 years on Syria from you, Mr. President. A veto that has once again stopped this council from creating the unity needed to give the people of Syria any hope for respite from their suffering. A veto that has once again denigrated the credibility and respect of the Security Council in the eyes of the world. A veto that is a cynical abuse of the privileges and responsibilities of permanent membership. And I simply cannot thank you for that. Nor can the thousands upon thousands of innocent men, women, and children trapped in Aleppo. Tonight, they will endure another night of fear, of pain, another night of wondering whether they will live to see the morning. 100,000 of them are children. The current tactics being used in Aleppo under the alibi of countering terrorism are turning a humanitarian crisis into a catastrophe. And your veto today, Mr. President, has only confirmed what we've known for so long. Russia's actions in recent weeks have exposed just how hollow Russia's commitment to the political process is. Today we have seen that commitment for what it really is, a sham. Instead of investing energy in peace and diplomacy, you have instead supported, facilitated and cooperated with the Syrian regime to retake and destroy areas standing against Assad, killing off, literally, those who want a moderate, peaceful and pluralistic future, free from both Assad's barbarism and the horrors inflicted by Daesh and other terrorists in Syria. And it is Syrian civilians who continue to bear the brunt of that cruelty and your complicity. Civilians, medics, white helmets, under direct attack from barrel bombs, cluster munitions, and incendiary weapons. And that's even before we mention the continued barbaric use of chemical weapons by the regime. I echo the words of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who described the destruction of Aleppo as the absolute contempt for the human spirit, for the dignity of the human being. This council cannot stand by while such misery is meted out on the people of Aleppo. And yet, thanks to you, Mr. President, that is exactly what we are doing. This text that you vetoed was not unreasonable. It called for sensible, overdue steps that would have saved lives, starting with the complete end of the bombardment of Aleppo. There can be no military justification for aerial attacks that indiscriminately hit civilians and their homes and their hospitals. This text called for full and unhindered humanitarian access. It is despicable that the regime continues to refuse access to besieged and hard-to-reach areas. It is despicable that the violence is so extreme that the safety even of humanitarian convoys cannot be assured, as seen through the strike on a UN aid convoy last month, for which the evidence is clear that Russia was responsible. And this text called for the full implementation of Resolution 2268 and the resumption of the cessation of hostilities. We see every day in Aleppo that there simply can be no military victory in this conflict. There can only be losers. And we see every day that obligation after obligation, set by resolution after resolution of this Council, are being flouted. We need Council unity to end this war, and that unity will only come when Russia changes its policy and stops the aerial bombardment. This has been a strong week for Council unity, and yet we have ended it on sadly familiar ground. We, the whole Council, stood with you on Wednesday as you announced the next Secretary-General. Thanks to your actions today, Antonio Guterres' job will be even harder. And worse still, thanks to your actions today, Syrians will continue to lose their lives in Aleppo and beyond to Russian and Syrian bombing. Please stop now.
I now give the floor to the representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to first acknowledge the presence of His Excellency Jean-Marc Ayrault, Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, and thank him for introducing draft resolution S/2016/846 co-authored by France and Spain. We also note draft S/2016/847 tabled by the Russian Federation, on which the Council will act on it after this. Mr. President, Malaysia has repeatedly called for this Council to act more decisively on Syria. We view this latest effort by France and Spain as an attempt to assert the Council's authority and discharge its responsibility to effectively address the deteriorating situations in Syria. We believe that this draft's main objective, aimed at preventing further escalations of violence and hostilities, including by calling for a halt to aerial bombardment, is key towards reducing the death and destructions which have disproportionately affected thousands of Syrian civilian populations, particularly women and children, for far too long. Cessation of aerial bombardment would have been a very welcome and necessary step in alleviating the despicable suffering of those civilians in eastern Aleppo who have borne the brunt of such bombardment in recent weeks. Of utmost importance to my delegations is the understanding that, had this draft been adopted, all parties to the conflict with the capacity to carry out airstrikes would have to heed the provisions of OP3 of the Franco-Spanish tax. Given its clarity of purpose and the compelling reasons behind it, my delegation voted in favor of the Franco-Spanish draft. We are gravely disappointed that it has been voted down. It is shameful and a betrayal of all the hopes pinned upon this Council to alleviate the dreadful suffering caused by a brutal conflict. Mr. President, briefly on draft S/2016/847, there is no question that the draft has some merit and contains elements that also speak to alleviating the humanitarian situation, as well as on restarting the political process in Syria and on combating terrorism. That notwithstanding, Malaysia and other members of these councils are not privy to the 9 September bilateral agreement between Russia and the US. Since the US has publicly repudiated the agreement on account of lack of implementations, we do not believe the Council is in a position to endorse such an agreement. Hence, we are not in a position to support this draft. Mr. President, we are fearful of the consequences of the Council's actions, particularly on the message of the Council's disunity that we have displayed today. This Council cannot afford to continue in this state of paralysis with total disregard to the abysmal situations faced by innocent civilians in Syria. With such disunity, how much hope and prayers can those besieged Syrians in such appalling situations have on us? This initiative today do not, in our view, represent the Council's best effort. The responsibility of addressing the conflict in Syria remains squarely on our shoulders. In these connections, a number of us could perhaps coalesce around a middle ground with the hope of finding a way out of the current stalemate and move closer towards a common understanding on ending hostilities and conflict. We will work certainly towards this end alongside interested Council members and other partners. We must never give up hope. We must not let Eastern Aleppo end tragically. I thank you.
Thank you to the representative of Malaysia for that statement. The representative of the U.S. has the floor.
Mr. President, yesterday we met in the consultations room and listened to UN Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura describe the daily, deadly, indiscriminate bombings raining down on eastern Aleppo. We heard Special Envoy de Mistura implore the Security Council to take urgent action to avert a large-scale massacre, noting that failure on our part would be a tragedy and a stain on this Security Council that lingers like others in recent history. The resolution vetoed by Russia today had a simple demand and one goal: stop the bombing in Aleppo city. Over the last 2 weeks, Russia and the Assad regime have launched a terrifying military offensive in eastern Aleppo that has laid waste to an area of the city with 275,000 civilians trapped inside of it. Airstrikes from this Russian and Syrian regime offensive have systematically eliminated whatever infrastructure was left to support the people of eastern Aleppo. Hospitals bombed, pumps for drinking water bombed, ambulances and fire trucks for first responders bombed, families trapped under the rubble, hundreds of civilians dead, hundreds of thousands of civilians at risk of literally starving to death if nothing changes. The Secretary General has described Aleppo as worse than a slaughterhouse. The UN Special Envoy has warned the city will be completely destroyed by the end of the year. And we know the cause. The airstrikes conducted by Russia and the Assad regime are the cause. Russia and Assad want to seize eastern Aleppo to further bolster the regime in Damascus. Russia could not let this resolution stand in their way, so they vetoed it. Russia dropped its veto here in the Security Council to strengthen Bashar al-Assad at the expense of 275,000 Syrians. We have heard so many warnings in this chamber, so many words of anguish offered, so many descriptions of the barbarism that is unfolding. Simply put, today was time for the Council to act, to learn the lessons of the recent past. We failed to do that because one of us, perversely the President of the United Nations Security Council, is intent on allowing the killing to continue and indeed participating in carrying it out. It is grotesque. Russia, as always, will offer a different narrative. Russia has said that they are fighting terrorism. They will probably somehow blame the United States of America for the suffering in Aleppo. They will suggest that we are the ones not serious about the fight against terrorism. They will invoke past conflicts in distant lands, and they will lie. In short, they will do anything and everything to deny and deflect from the truth. The truth is that Russia is using counterterrorism as an excuse to help the Assad regime retake control of Aleppo by brutal force, snuff out whatever opposition groups dare to resist the Assad regime's brutality, and cow civilians who yearn for a different government into submission. As Secretary of State John Kerry said, this is a targeted strategy to terrorize civilians and kill anybody and everybody who is in the way of their military objectives. There is no other plausible explanation. Why else would the first targets in the Syrian-Russian offensive be hospitals and bases for first responders, which should have been protected? Why else would each hospital in eastern Aleppo have been struck not once, but at least twice? Why else would a convoy of life-saving humanitarian aid bound for Aleppo be destroyed? One doesn't have to be an international legal scholar to know that there is a term that may well describe these actions: war crimes, and they must be investigated. Russia cannot use the presence of what the United Nations estimates to be a couple of hundred members of al-Nusra to justify an indiscriminate aerial bombing campaign devastating an entire population of hundreds of thousands of civilians currently trapped by Russia and the regime. Russia has the privilege of serving as a permanent member of the Security Council with a responsibility to maintain international peace and security. But through the campaign it describes as counterterrorism, Russia has become one of the chief purveyors of terror in Aleppo, using tactics more commonly associated with thugs than governments. Russia and the Assad regime think the world will look the other way if they recite the word counterterrorism. That is wrong. And each and every one of us must make that clear to Russia. There are terrorists in Syria, a lot of them. The United States doesn't need anyone to explain why terrorists are serious, deadly, and dangerous. That there are terrorists in Syria is the reason the United States leads a 67-member coalition in the region to fight them. It is why the United States remains unambiguous in our call for opposition groups to separate themselves from al-Nusra. It is why this week the United States conducted an airstrike that targeted a senior Nusra leader in Idlib, Syria. The United States will be relentless in our fight against terrorism. We spent months looking for a way to work with Russia on a campaign that would have effectively targeted al-Nusra. We agreed on a way forward that would have allowed us to focus on terrorist targets. In return, we asked that Russia show a good faith commitment by upholding a cessation of hostilities and allowing for humanitarian aid. When presented with this opportunity to cooperate on counterterrorism, Russia decided to walk away. Russia decided to ignore this council's repeated calls to implement the cessation of hostilities. Russia decided that it would support the Assad regime's military campaign to retake every inch of Syria, to use Assad's own words. Some here today will criticize this resolution for lacking balance. But there is no balance in the bombardment of eastern Aleppo. It's simple. Russia and the Assad regime have launched the deadliest campaign of aerial bombardment since 2011. Russia and the Assad regime are using incendiary weapons and bunker bombs, which are magnifying human suffering, hitting even doctors trying to treat patients in basement emergency rooms, because nowhere else was safe. Russia and the Syrian regime are causing this bloody chaos. So we must demand that the ones responsible for this air campaign stop. This is not how you defeat terrorists, it's how you create them. In this conflict, violence begets violence. Our effort today was to stop bombardments over Aleppo, nothing more. It's a deadly shame that we were unable to do so. The United States remains committed to finding ways to de-escalate this violence, put a ceasefire in place, and start a genuine political process. But for that to happen, there must be an end to the horrific suffering of the people of eastern Aleppo, caused by the current president of the Security Councils and Syrian aircraft. It is time for Russia to stop starving and killing Aleppo's children. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to the representative of New Zealand.
Thank you for giving me the floor, Mr. President. The situation in Aleppo is devastating, as Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura made very clear to us yesterday. He warned us we face a situation not dissimilar to those in Rwanda and Srebrenica, atrocities this Council signally failed to prevent. We must learn our lessons. We must stop the destruction of the entire city of eastern Aleppo. Terrorism is a scourge to the world, but it is not acceptable that Russia and Syria use counter-terrorism as a pretext for a large-scale bombing campaign for which civilians are paying the greatest price. Whatever the sins of the hundreds or 1,000+ terrorists in eastern Aleppo, that cannot justify the prolonged bombardment of 275,000 civilians. We had hoped that the Council would have been able to come together on a text which all parties could accept and which could stand a chance of contributing to a practical and constructive action on the ground. The failure of today's resolution contributes to the polarised dynamic on Syria among the major powers and undermines the credibility of the Security Council. Given the recent breakdown of the cessation of hostilities and the curtailing of diplomatic efforts by the United States and Russia, it is vital to use all multilateral channels, particularly this Council, to move the parties away from the killing and back towards the negotiating table, and in the meantime to spare the Syrian people and allow them the humanitarian assistance they so desperately need. This Council has a special responsibility. We will continue to talk with other Council members to explore what action might be possible in the coming days. I thank you.
Я благодарю.
Thank you. We know that New Zealand attempted to draft a resolution which would have been a happy medium between the two approaches we are seeing today, and we regret that some influential members of the Council didn't allow your draft to go forward. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, Ukraine co-sponsored and voted in favor of this draft resolution. We commend the hard work by the French and Spanish delegations in drafting and negotiating it. We are extremely dismayed, but not surprised, by the fact that all these efforts were at the end derailed by the veto power of Russia. This is the fifth veto exercised by Russia with respect to Syria draft resolutions over the past years. Had the resolution seen the light and been adopted, it would have been a real, meaningful step towards exercising the preventing diplomacy by this Council. It would have helped to prevent what is about to become one of the gravest humanitarian tragedies of our times. History will hold accountable those who didn't let this Council discharge its duties. Bearing in mind a clear humanitarian character of the draft resolution aimed at stopping complete erasing of eastern Aleppo by the end of the year, we acted fully in line with the Code of Conduct regarding Security Council action against genocide, crimes against humanity or war crimes, which Ukraine joined last year. We are extremely disappointed that the political statement on the suspension of the veto in case of mass atrocities, an initiative designed to curb the use of veto by the permanent members of the Council, is yet to gain traction. And here again, the Russian Federation is interested more in safeguarding its privileges than in fulfilling its responsibilities before the international community. For Ukraine, it is not something new. We have seen Russia exercising its veto quite recently in March 2014 and July 2015. In those cases, Council's action would have saved thousands of human lives and sent a powerful message to perpetrators of heinous acts against civilians, and their crimes would not go unpunished. What we see today has a meaning. Russia's policies remain unchanged. If the current dynamics in the Syrian conflict continue and the logic of war prevails over the voices of peace, we as international community face a real risk of a protracted deadly conflict lasting for many years ahead. Repercussions of such a scenario are a Pandora box that is easy to open but nearly impossible to close. More refugees flowing to Europe and other places, more destabilization in the neighboring countries, rising death toll, and deepening humanitarian crisis. If this is not a hybrid warfare Russia is waging to reassert itself in the world at any price, then black is white and white is black. Those who oppose peace and prolonged war risk setting wider region ablaze in a fire of sectarian war and radicalization, giving more space to the extremists to exploit. Finally, I want to echo Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura's words that we don't want to live through another Srebrenica and Rwanda. To this I would add, we also don't want to live through another Grozny.
Now I give the floor to the representative of Senegal. President, thank you very much for giving me the floor. The situation in Syria is intolerable. against the noise of bombs day after day, meeting after meeting, negotiation after negotiation, and resolution after resolution. Human beings are annihilated. Homes, schools, health facilities are bombed to the ground in total violation of international humanitarian law. My president, Macky Sall, here on 22 September, under the presidency of New Zealand, said these things. In deciding to vote in favor of the resolution circulated by France and Spain, Senegal was echoing the heartfelt appeal of the Special Envoy for Syria, Mr. de Mistura, namely, that the Council must act in an urgent manner to ensure that the eastern part of Aleppo not become a hitherto unseen tragedy. Senegal was hoping that the time had come where the Security Council, as guarantor of international peace and security, would shoulder its responsibilities to reestablish a ceasefire, not just in eastern Aleppo, but also across Syria. Most unfortunately, the draft resolution circulated by France and Spain didn't move forward. Mr. de Mistura warned us about the risk of seeing Aleppo completely destroyed over the next 2 months, with thousands and dead and wounded if airstrikes were to continue. Yet again, my delegation takes this opportunity to call upon the International Syria Support Group, in particular its 2 co-chairs, to continue necessary efforts for an effective and lasting truce across Syria. This would allow for the unhampered provision and unconditioned provision of humanitarian assistance, as well as the resumption of a credible process under the aegis of the United Nations on the basis of the Geneva Communiqué and Resolution 2254. President, if we don't rally around this objective of peace and stability in Syria, it's possible that terrorists will come out strengthened from this, including ISIL and the Jabhat al-Nusra or al-Sham front. These are our common enemies. They should be fought in the framework of a comprehensive strategy. Thank you. Thank you to the representative of Senegal. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Mr. President, Japan supported the French and Spanish proposal because it demands, among others, that all parties immediately end all aerial bombardments over Aleppo. These bombardments are ruthlessly destroying hospitals and killing civilians. The situation is devastating. It is deeply regrettable that the Security Council has failed thus far to overcome its differences. All military activities in eastern Aleppo must be halted immediately, particularly the indiscriminate attacks which are violating international humanitarian law. Today's failure to adopt a resolution which would have improved the humanitarian situation in Aleppo is yet another unfortunate example of the Security Council not being able to take effective measures on a matter of great urgency. But this should not be an excuse for inaction in the crisis in Aleppo. There are pressing humanitarian needs on the ground. We must undertake measures to enable immediate medical evacuation as well as the movement of humanitarian supplies from Western Aleppo. This Council has a responsibility to take concrete actions that bring about actual changes on the ground. The Syrian people have already suffered far too long. Thank you.
Thank you to the representative of Japan. I now give the floor to the representative of Venezuela.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since we are committed to full respect of international humanitarian law. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela condemns, irrespective of who carries them out, the indiscriminate attacks against civilian population and humanitarian staff, and the bombings of hospitals, health facilities, as we denounced it in the case of the Gaza Strip and the occupied territories of the Palestinian state of Palestine, as well as in Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, and in this case Syria. Nevertheless, we voted against the draft resolution on the situation in East Aleppo, since we consider that this text does not contribute to a balanced approach to the humanitarian problem that is severely impacting the civilian population in that province because of the terrorist barbarism of the al-Nusra Front and its related groups and the larger war in that country. We have seen with concern that while the humanitarian situation does require basic concrete responses in terms of impartiality, objectivity, and non-politicization, in this case, the noble aim of humanitarian aid has been used by individual states in this Security Council for their political agenda, to the detriment of the Syrian people. In this context, attempts are being made to use the humanitarian tragedy of the people in eastern Aleppo to make Syria and Russia responsible for the worsening humanitarian situation in this area, when in fact the real responsibilities responsible for this tragedy are the terrorist groups who enjoy foreign support. They've been committing atrocious crimes against the Syrian people, and this for the last 5 years, with the aim to overthrow a legitimate government. We cannot ignore the fact that there are other players involved in this conflict within the Security Council, and therefore, on this issue, the members of the Security Council have a shared and differentiated responsibility. These players have directly participated in the armed conflict since it began, supplying weapons to violent non-state actors that then become terrorist groups, including those groups that are no longer under its control, and now they claim that they ignore the consequences of their own acts. They are engaging in dramatic rhetoric while they continue to fuel the war not only in Syria but throughout the Middle East. We consider that there was a genuine interest in having a consensus text, and if so, this Council would have been in a position to have a resolution that would reflect the unity of this body. But unfortunately, the political agendas of some member states, members of the Security Council, did prevent a positive outcome to the detriment of the people of Aleppo. The obstinate insistency on submitting this draft to the Council, while aware it was not viable, has deepened the divisions within this collegiate body. And now there is the risk of compromising the progress that had been achieved, particularly between the co-chairs of the International Support Group for Syria, the Russian Federation, and the efforts of Mr. Stefan de Mistura, the Special Envoy. Mr. President, combating terrorism, which the governments of Syria and Russia are doing in a coordinated way, should not be seen as an alibi for destroying the Syrian population in eastern Aleppo. Some are trying to promote the idea that this is the case. In fact, the real threat in this area is represented by more than thousands of fighters of al-Nusra and other terrorist groups who are holding hostage over 200,000 civilians living there. These people are used as a human shield in violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And we recall that a humanitarian corridor was open to unblock the Aleppo, and the terrorists actually killed those who tried to ensure this corridor. Given that combating terrorism is a shared objective of the international community, as was expressed in the various Security Council resolutions, we don't understand how the so-called moderate opposition has not separated itself once and for all from the al-Nusra Front. If its intentions for peace and stability are sincere in Syria, the moderate opposition should join the efforts being made to eliminate the scourge of terrorism and participate in a decisive way in the peace talks without any preconditions. And this means that it's urgent to put an end to the support from the outside to armed groups who are becoming terrorist groups. And it's vital to urgently implement the cessation of hostilities agreed to on the 9th of September. On the other hand, it's quite paradoxical that the aim of the resolution that we're dealing with demands of Syria that it should limit its legitimate right to exercise full sovereignty over its territory, in particularly over its airspace, through a ban on military flights over Aleppo. This demand contrasts with the flexibility or the omission of this Security Council in other conflicts such as the Gaza Strip, Baghdad, Yemen, Afghanistan and Fallujah. We insist that the issues in the Security Council cannot be dealt with on the basis of double standards. We consider that the full enjoyment of the sovereignty, which expressed in the control of its territory, is a guarantee of fighting the scourge of terrorism in Syria. So we wonder how the right of Syria to reassert its sovereignty can be limited when the Charter of the United Nations itself embodies this, as it does embody the territorial integrity and political independence as essential preconditions for international peace and security. This Security Council does not have the right to weaken the sovereignty of member states, nor can it decide if a government is legitimate or not. This lies with the peoples themselves. We cannot allow a repetition of the disastrous experiences of military aggression in Iraq, Libya, and others, which did so much harm to the people by creating favourable conditions following the dismantling of the political and institutional structures of those countries, allowing the expansion of Al-Qaeda and the emergence of ISIS and Daesh. Finally, we reject any manipulation of the humanitarian drama in Syria with external support and foreign actors. We remain firm, despite the pressure and the manipulations through the media, to deal with this theme not in double standards. We defend the principles of the United Nations Charter, and we are working for a political solution, a negotiated solution to this dreadful conflict. We will continue to work towards peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you to the representative of Venezuela for that statement. Now, I will put to a vote the draft resolution contained in document S 2016-847, submitted by the Russian Federation. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2016/847 please raise their hand?
Благодарю вас.
Thank you very much. Votes against? Thank you. Abstentions? Thank you.
Два воздержалось. 5 за. Так. Результаты голосования.
The result of the voting is as follows: 4 in favor, 9 against, 2 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted, having failed to obtain the required number of votes. I now give the floor to members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of Egypt.
Mr. President, I find myself short of words to express our deep sorrow for the scene we are today witnessing, or the escalation that called upon the Security Council to convene before the whole world to convey a message of failure to the Syrian people. Regrettably, Mr. President, this council, which was created in the last century to peacefully settle disputes, is gradually becoming no more than a media platform, and instead of holding serious political consultations in its open and closed sessions to stop the Syrian bloodletting, consultations have amounted to no more than repetition of traditional positions and a dialogue of the deaf. We used to prepare our statements to deliver them in this chamber to express condemnation and denunciation, or new ideas to discharge ourselves of what has happened and what is happening in Syria. We forgot that the impacts of our statements hardly go beyond this building or means of mass media. Whereas the tragedy of the bereaved Syrian people continues, with half of the Syrian population displaced and hundreds of thousands of its children, women and men killed. And allow me to express my sorrow and sympathy with any Syrian citizen who is following this session. However, I might even wonder, is there really anybody in Syria who is interested in following this session? Mr. President, Egypt has voted in favor of 2 draft resolutions that were put forward for voting today, which are targeting the de-escalation in Syria, especially in Aleppo. Unfortunately, and although we have previously known that these 2 drafts will fail, our voting was only coming to express the position of Egypt, which can no more tolerate the tampering with the destiny of Arab peoples in the region. Today, we are only conveying a message from the biggest Arab people to the international, regional, and internal powers in Syria. Put an end to the tragedy in Syria. Or just put an end to the political competition, ambitions, and disputes that are claiming lives of Syrians. Mr. President, I would not like to conclude my statement with paying condolences, because we are still have a window of opportunity to seriously handle the Syrian crisis, and if the members of this council have all expressed their desire to put an end to the bloodletting, Egypt will take this seriously. Therefore, and notwithstanding the difference of the approach that was involved in both drafts that were put forward for voting today, let's agree that these 2 draft resolutions covered key points that should serve as foundation for us to build on during the coming days. And these are the points that we have voted in favor of today. First, the imperative of stopping any targeting of Syrian civilians and civilian establishments, and the necessity of working on the unhindered humanitarian access in coordination with the United Nations. Number 2, that we have to work to implement the cessation of hostilities in Syria, which would eventually pave the way for full ceasefire, with giving priority to Aleppo according to Resolution 2268, together with enhancing the supervision mechanism and the monitoring mechanism. The third point is that it's very important to handle the disregard by certain armed groups of the will and volition of the international community and the ambitions of the Syrian people for a better future, by their determination and persistence on cooperation with terrorist groups, especially the Nusra Front and Sham Front. Fourth point is the responsibility that should be shouldered by the Security Council, as well as the pivotal role that is carried out by the International Syria Support Group and its co-chairmanship to work and to endeavor for the realization of the foregoing points. The fifth point, which is related to starting or resuming serious negotiations between the Syrian parties regarding the transitory phase according to the Geneva Communiqué and the Security Council Resolution 2254. Mr. President, Egypt is fully prepared to work within the framework of the ISSG and the Security Council, whether with the permanent or the non-permanent members of the Security Council, to carry out and achieve the elements that I have referred to earlier. In conclusion, let me call upon the members to endeavour so that the Security Council would restore its role and for the open and serious discussion in order to put an end to the Syrian tragedy. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to Egypt for that statement. The representative of UK, please.
Mr. President, a lonely veto, and then just 4 votes in favour of your text. A double humiliation. This text was a cynical attempt to divert attention from your veto today that once again denied any hope to the people of Aleppo. It failed because it failed to demand an immediate end to the aerial bombardment of Aleppo. It's a sham, just as Russia's hollow commitment to a political process in Syria is a sham. The indiscriminate bombing of civilians in Aleppo is sickening and barbaric. Please, stop now.
I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Mr. President, this text was a deceptive attempt to get the Security Council to ratify what Russia and the regime are doing in Aleppo, as they will undoubtedly claim that any and all of the devastation they are raining down is directed at terrorists, not the innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure they are very clearly striking. But I will not belabor this point. What Russia wants is for there to be more talk while they seek to take the city by brutal force. What we want is less talk and more action for them to stop the slaughter.
I now give the floor to the representative of Venezuela.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Effectively and fortunately, this Security Council today has demonstrated its inability to achieve consensus on how to manage and resolve the horrible tragedy being faced by the people of Syria since the war began. The basic reason for this situation, this lack of unity, is based in the fact that some permanent members of the Security Council are deeply involved in the conflict, and they have supported the development of this asymmetric war, which is a new mechanism which is absolutely illegal to overthrow governments. The statement made by Egypt was important because, unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of people are dying. People on the ground are repaying the price for this disastrous policy in the Middle East, and that is the Syrian people. In our view, the non-permanent members of the Security Council, for us, this is an alert, and we must considerably think in depth in the Security Council that we are encouraging conflicts by taking steps which totally violate the United Nations Charter, and they totally violate everything that is represented by the international legal system. We, as a country, we have a sovereign country, but we don't have any military or geopolitical interests that go beyond our own borders. We see the need to raise our voice so that we should indicate to the international community we will defend those principles which underlie the United Nations, and this is respect for sovereignty, respect for the non-interference in the internal affairs of peoples, and the concept that sovereignty lies in the people of a given country. These are fundamental principles. Nobody in this Security Council can decide whether the government of Syria is legitimate or not. Nobody in the Security Council has the power or the right to suppress the sovereignty of the Syrian government over its own territory. We've already had painful experiences that need to be analysed and discussed in depth to assess the question whether this Security Council is in fact fulfilling the role it was given when the United Nations was established. We see ourselves in the midst of a conflict between powerful countries, and we need to defend these principles. There's much pressure is being generated in order to ensure that the brother countries, particularly non-permanent members, should align themselves with one or other position. We make an appeal to everybody to respect the principles. We make an appeal to respect these principles as the only way to come up with a political solution, not only to the Syrian conflict, but also to the conflict in Yemen, in Palestine, and in so many other countries. The use of the veto by Russia was criticized, but we believe that the veto in many cases does serve to establish balance in situations which are totally out of balance. We do hope that the intervention if only they could have vetoed the attacks on Iraq and Libya. Otherwise, if that had been the case, we wouldn't be dealing with the situation we're facing today. On many occasions, double standards are at play. There's double standards in dealing with situations. Some members who are directly involved in the conflict make dramatic stories about the humanitarian situation. Of course, this humanitarian suffering is regrettable, but they are totally silent, inexplicably silent, about the suffering of the Palestinian people, for example, during the dreadful Israeli attacks in the Gaza Strip, or they're inexplicably silent in other conflicts, such as in Yemen. Mr. President, we voted in favor of the second resolution proposed by the Russian Federation because, as the resolution proposed by New Zealand, that there were elements present that could have led the Security Council to express its unity with regard to the need to deal with the suffering of the civilians in East Aleppo and throughout Syria. We believe that this Security Council, once we've demonstrated to the public our lack of unity in this regard, we should work in a constructive way beyond our own national agendas to come up with a political and negotiated solution to this tragedy. We must put an end to the killing in Syria. We must put an end to interventionism in Syria. We must end the supply of weapons to groups that are not able to disassociate themselves from terrorist groups. The United Nations should, and this Security Council must come up with a negotiated solution to conflicts, or as we have said, the terrorism will continue to bring suffering to the people of the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you to the representative of Venezuela. I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, Ukraine voted against the resolution proposed by the Russian Federation for the following reasons. We simply cannot agree with the tactics that aims to divert the attention from the solid and meaningful draft resolution that could have relevance on the ground and help stop Aleppo massacre. The resolution document you proposed hardly mentioned the devastating developments in Aleppo, which is cynical given the gravity of the situation in this symbolic Syrian city. We also strongly condemn this attempt to put for a vote a draft resolution that has never been discussed in the Council.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the representative of China.
谢谢主席先生。中方关注近期叙利亚有关地区冲突升级。
China has followed the escalation of conflicts in relevant regions in Syria. Thank you, Mr. President. China has followed the escalation of conflicts in relevant regions in Syria. We feel deeply the sufferings caused by the war to the people in Syria. China strongly condemns all terrorist activities that harm and kill innocent lives. On the question of Syria, the international community should keep to the general direction for a political solution and push for a solution to the question of Syria, to the dispute through dialogue by all the parties in Syria, so that war could be ended as early as possible. Actions taken by the Security Council should be able to truly help ease the situation, to help improve the situation, to help push for the cessation of hostilities by the parties, support and coordinate UN efforts for humanitarian assistance, should be instrumental to stronger efforts to combat terrorist groups as designated by the Security Council, including ISIS. The actions should be able to help seek a solution acceptable by all the parties in a political process owned and led by the Syrians under the auspices of the United Nations. The draft resolution submitted by France and Spain contains a number of important elements, such as cessation of a ceasefire, a call for political solution, improvement of humanitarian situation, and enhanced efforts to combat terrorism. But some of the content in the draft resolution does not reflect a full respect for the sovereignty, independence, unification, and territorial integrity of Syria. And the constructive views of some of the members of the Security Council were not incorporated, and China had to abstain in the vote on this draft resolution. The draft resolution submitted by the Russian Federation to the Security Council urges the parties to cease their hostilities, to open humanitarian access, to enhance efforts to combat terrorism, to support the good offices by Special Envoy de Mistura, and call for early reception of the peace talks in Geneva. The draft resolution reflected the four-track ideas, that is, ceasefire, humanitarian assistance, joint efforts in combating terrorism, and political negotiations. It also reflected a respect for the sovereignty, independence, unification, and territorial integrity of Syria, with content that is complete, that is comprehensive and balanced. China voted in favor of the draft resolution, and we regret that the resolution was not adopted. Mr. President, Syria is an important country in the Middle East. An early restoration of peace and stability is in the common interest of Syria, the countries in the region, and that of the international community. China hopes that the Security Council will really take safety as the first priority, take safety of the Syrian people as the first priority, and stay united to build up consensus, to continue our efforts to push for a political solution for the question of Syria, to jointly work to prevent the expansion and the spread of terrorism, and play a positive and constructive role in maintaining peace and stability in Syria and the region. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you to China for that. New Zealand has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. New Zealand voted against the draft resolution submitted by the Russian Federation because of the partial and misleading nature of the draft, because of Russia's destructive role in the Syrian conflict, and because Russia provided no scope for any negotiation on a text on such a sensitive issue, an issue to which Russia is a direct party. Action of this kind only serves to deepen the divides in the Council, which are preventing constructive action from being taken. As you earlier observed, Mr. President, New Zealand has been working on some ideas to try and bring this Council together on this most difficult issue. That we have not yet done so, put our ideas forward, has been our decision and our decision alone. But I invite Russia and all Council members to work with us in the coming days to see if we can chart a course in a more positive direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, New Zealand. Uruguay has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we've already in this room been saying that we are in pain over Syria and all those other places where the civilian population is being submitted to the brutalities of war. We've also said in this very chamber, Mr. President, that we are pained as we make these speeches. Bombs continue to fall on the civilian populations in hospitals and schools. And in this very chamber, we have said, Mr. President, that what is happening in Aleppo is, without any doubt, a very real massacre. It's important today that we have a cessation of hostilities, an end of the bombings, and to put an end to the carnage. Allow me also, Mr. President, to say the following. The babies who were pulled out of the rubble in Aleppo, these are not terrorists, these babies. These old people who are in the rubble of their own houses, these old people are not terrorists. The people drawn out from hospitals in Aleppo, these patients, these are not terrorists. The children who are buried in the rubble of their schools, they are not terrorists. Now, as to the draft resolution S/2016/847, my delegation abstained for reasons of procedure and of substance. Now, as to the procedures, this was given yesterday at 5 p.m. And it wasn't subject for negotiation. There was no negotiation possible. You just had to vote in favour or against. But briefly reading through it, we saw that this draft resolution includes a bilateral agreement on which the Security Council did not have any consent nor reason for having it. And we all know that on this agreement there is a strong discrepancy between those who would sign it, and it's not up to the Security Council to mediate in this regard. Now, on the substance, Mr. President, well, this draft resolution does not include something vital at this stage, here and now, and that is to put an end to the bombing in Aleppo. My delegation is committed and will continue to work in the Security Council to relaunch a negotiations process that would contribute to ending this situation and turn it towards a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uruguay. Angola has the floor.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council were today confronted with a peculiar situation: to cast votes in a row on two resolutions over the same issue on the cessation of hostilities in Syria. First and foremost, we would like to state our deep distress about the current humanitarian situation in Aleppo, which has left the vast majority of the city's population without access to basic necessities and life-saving assistance, while the horrific bloodshed, in particular in eastern Aleppo, has caused far too many deaths and injuries among the civilian population. Mr. President, in Aleppo, we are witnessing a true destruction of history to which we in this Council can, if we act constructive and decisively, put a stop. The bombing of hospitals is unacceptable, and we strongly condemn such actions. However, regional and international stakeholders who are directly involved in this conflict by supplying weapons and logistic support to belligerents which are guilty of gross human rights violations command the greatest responsibility in solving this grave issue. We expect the permanent members of this Council with special responsibilities in the maintenance of peace and security to set the example by putting aside strategic interests and mobilize all possible political action and will, for the sake of the Syrian civilians we are called upon to protect. Even though the brave and dedicated members of the UN and other humanitarian agencies continue to operate in Syria, in reality, the latest wave of fighting in Aleppo has caused the destruction of essential infrastructure, such as schools, hospitals, ambulances, and depleted the medical staff able to provide much-needed care and assistance. The numbers of casualties, wounded, and displaced are absolutely overwhelming. Mr. President, we have here today voted on the two draft resolutions which, in our opinion, contain constructive proposals, and we find most unfortunate the inability to make progress on a single resolution addressing the most pressing concerns, which are the protection of civilians, the cessation of hostilities, and put in track a political process conducive to lasting peace in Syria. Angola abstained on the two resolutions, the resolution tabled by France and Spain, because, in our view, it does not address the fundamental issue, that is, to revive the process conducive to a meaningful cessation of hostilities, and the contrary, seeks to feed the acrimonious and dangerous debate among main players in the conflict, permanent members of the Council, and most probably will represent the burial of the International Syrian Support Group. Mr. President, while the Russian proposal contains some positive elements with a view to relaunching the process conducive to the cessation of hostilities, Angola decided to abstain in the vote to avoid being dragged in the unfortunate prevailing acrimony between members of this Council, which bear the main responsibility for the conflict and the duty for finding solutions to it. We support Special Envoy de Mistura efforts and his permanent commitment with a view to relaunch the cessation of hostilities agreement, guarantee safe and unrestricted humanitarian access, as well as resuming repairs of Aleppo damaged water and power facilities, and allow medical evacuation for urgent cases in and around the city. Surely this effort depends on the cooperation between the Russian Federation and the United States, and we deeply regret the suspension of bilateral discussion on the cessation of hostilities between these two chairs of the International Support Group, Ceasefire Force, Task Force. We sincerely hope that the respective governments will be able to agree on the importance of maintaining lines of dialogue open and renew cooperation in the search of peace, in the fight against terrorism, and in easing the plight of the Syrian civilians who bear the heaviest burden of this conflict. In conclusion, after the show of unity at the Security Council on the recommendation for the next Secretary General, today's events are a very negative signal on the Council's ability to contribute meaningfully to international peace and security, which we deeply regret. Angola reiterates its determination to remain engaged in the search for peace, to save lives in Syria by advancing the political process through negotiations and dialogue involving, above all, Syrians. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much to the representative of Angola for that statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Mr. President, we voted against the proposal submitted by the Russian Federation. I repeat what I said earlier this afternoon. All aerial bombardments over Aleppo must be ended immediately. All military activities in eastern Aleppo must be halted immediately, particularly the indiscriminate attacks which are violating international humanitarian law. Had the US-Russian agreement of 9 September been in effect, we may have been able to implement measures based on that. Sadly, this is not the case. Japan cannot support the Russian proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the representative of Japan for that statement. We're still going to hear a statement from the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. In my national capacity, just a few words. I'm going to be very brief because we're still going to be hearing from another speaker. The representative of the United States, as well as the one from UK, as usual, stuck to their provocation rhetoric. We're used to this free-flowing discourse, and we're not going to react to it. Attempt to insult don't get us angry, and they also don't distract us from what's most important. But I really do have two topics I'd like to touch upon, though. The representative of the UK said that, called upon us to stop now. Stop now. Well, why don't you stop now? Supporting all ruffians across the world, including terrorists and all of those who are exacerbating the situation. Stop intervening in the internal affairs of sovereign states. Stop your colonial habits. Leave the world in peace. And then maybe the situation would improve in many areas and regions of the world. The argument put forth by the United States. More action is needed. Yes, we agree. The Minister of Foreign Affairs and Secretary of State over a few months drew up an agreement, but the United States was unable to implement it. They weren't able to separate the moderate opposition from terrorists. They weren't able even to ensure the withdrawal of opposition groups from the Castello Road, which would have ensured better conditions for providing for the humanitarian needs of eastern Aleppo. More action. Well, I think there was an important thought put forth by Uruguay that terrorists are the ones acting, but civilians are the ones suffering. Well, politicians are to blame here with their unsavory plans that they're attempting to implement across the globe, and civilians are suffering. Politicians, they don't even acknowledge their huge mistakes, if not crimes, that their policies lead to, including an exacerbation of conflict, as well as uncontrolled consequences across the globe. And then perhaps to the representative of Angola, who said he was worried that what was going on could mean the death of the ISSG, the burial of it. We don't think that's right. We think that we've retained the multilateral format. Our draft today, which, as I said, we weren't expecting it would be adopted. It was just a political demonstration, if you like. It was attempting to retain the multilateral format. And what's valuable, and that had been drafted in the U.S.-Russian agreement, well, it wasn't implemented, but we think that it could have been. I'd like to reassure you that very complicated multilateral and bilateral work is ongoing, and we do continue to hope that the situation in Syria will go back to normal. And this would have a most a most beneficial effect on the situation in eastern Aleppo. And we hope that happens as quickly as possible. Now I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Clearly, Mr. President, that words of the truth does make the representatives of colonial powers go insane in this chamber. We see them leave the room when they hear words of truth spoken. They prove this way that they have colonial malicious intentions against my country and the people of Syria, and that their diplomacy is a diplomacy of chaos, coercion, and use of force, and not a diplomacy of dialogue and resolving conflict by peaceful means. Hence, and after some colleagues have left the chamber, I would like to thank them, because they have given me the attribute of a permanent representative on their behalf. A permanent member on their behalf. Corrects the interpreter. I thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to congratulate you on presiding over the work of the Council for this month, at a time when the world in general and our region in particular go through major and serious challenges due to the erroneous policies of some states, including permanent members of the Security Council, as they seek to implement their own interventionist policies that contradict with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. Mr. President, your wisdom and experience are a safety valve for the work of the Council at this critical time. Allow me, Mr. President, in this occasion to condemn the cowardly act of terrorism that Al-Nusra Front has perpetrated against the Russian embassy in Damascus a few days ago. There are member states that voted positively for the French draft resolution, but they opposed releasing even a press statement that condemns this act. We are also sorry that the Security Council failed to adopt the draft resolution that you tabled, with a view to achieving a calm and pushing the political process in Syria through differentiating between the so-called moderate armed opposition forces and the terrorist Al-Nusra Front organization. Blocking the Russian draft resolution reaffirms for the 100th time that there is no political will for those who stood against this draft resolution. They have no real political will to combat terrorism, no genuine will, and no genuine will to reach an intra-Syrian resolution of the crisis. And clearly, Mr. President, that this differentiation between the extremist terrorist and the moderate armed groups is a difficult process that very much is like the separation between uranium, enriched uranium from unenriched uranium, if there is actually uranium that is not enriched. Mr. President, I have not bothered to reflect upon the French draft resolution. It was crystal clear that it had its own objectives. This was clear, not just to me, but to the Syrian people, as we recall the 100th anniversary of the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement. This agreement has caused continuous suffering. This is a colonial agreement between France and Britain that has brought continuous suffering. This agreement has partitioned our peoples, looted our wealth and resources. We think that this French draft resolution reflects the nostalgia of this country to their dark colonial past, and history. They were under the illusion that fueling the Syrian crisis would be a golden opportunity for them to regain a colonial power that would never be revived. The Foreign Minister of France has today practiced a policy of guardianship over the Syrian people. He spoke today of what is good for the Syrian people and what he, as a French minister, should do to help and assist the Syrian people. As if he still dreams that he represents a colonial power that can hijack the right to speak on behalf of the Syrian people in this council. However, French politicians should be ashamed of what they've done to Libya and the Libyan people. As for talk of the Guernica and Srebrenica massacres, these two massacres were because of European competitive barbaric policies that we have absolutely no relation to, not us, not anyone else, purely European barbaric policies. As for the carnage against Syria today, it is caused by mercenary foreign terrorists that were born in France, Britain, Germany, Italy, Norway, Spain, Belgium. These are terrorists that are manipulated by the intelligence of Western states, specialized Western intelligence forces, and also the fatwas of jihad and the Qatari and Saudi funds and the Turkish sponsorship of all this process of aggression. Before I go into my statement, I would like to remind the French minister of what his predecessor, Rouen de Fadou, said in 2012, and I quote in French. Syrian jihadists, French jihadists are doing a good job in Syria. This is the policy of France, as expressed by the foreign minister of France at the time in 2012, Laurent Fabius. Elements and provisions of the French draft resolution has proved yet again that they have ill intentions against my country. This is the ill intention of the successive French governments that have sought since the beginning to undermine the entire Syrian state in its totality, not just simply targeting a particular government. The draft resolution clearly calls for an end of the Syrian army operations that conducts with its allies operations to defend the Syrian people and combat terrorism on behalf of all of you against Al-Nusra Front, ISIL, and affiliated terrorist groups. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a given that whenever the Syrian army and its allies gain ground against the terrorist groups, namely Al-Nusra Front, whenever this happens, members of the council, well-known members of the council, rush to rescue them from their inevitable fate through convening sessions or tabling draft resolutions that completely disregard the suffering of the Syrian people. It only seeks to rescue the terrorists, whether in Aleppo or other regions and cities of Syria. Mr. President, we hope that this unprecedented and tireless effort by France to push for the adoption of this draft resolution, we hope that this, like the case with the draft resolution by Russia, we hope that it would have been channeled to find a political solution for the crisis in Syria, led by Syrians without any foreign intervention or preconditions. We hoped that instead of tabling a draft resolution to impose a no-fly zone in our own country, Syria, in our airspace, we hope that they would have imposed a moratorium on the support that the governments provide to terrorism that they export to my country, Syria. We hoped that the government of France would able to answer the question that the Syrian people continue to ask. Is a Total deal, or the money of the Qatari gas, and the arms deals with Saudi Arabia, are all of these worth the Syrian blood that was spilled? The United States, France, and Britain, for more than 6 years, have persistently called for one session following another. They have sponsored draft resolutions, presidential statements, press statements in the Council, with one purpose: to deceive the public opinion that they are seeking to resolve the crisis in my country. At the same time, they have launched media, diplomatic, and political campaigns to falsely promote ideas, namely that what's happening in Syria is a confrontation between the so-called moderate armed opposition and government forces that they accuse of committing war crimes. They completely disregard the fact that their policies have put in jeopardy the lives of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in Syria through their continued support to the armed terrorist groups that have used civilians as human shields. In eastern Aleppo, the terrorists have turned the most important, the biggest eye care hospital in the Middle East to a base for their military operation. This is an answer to remarks by some colleagues who talked about targeting hospitals. I would like to remind you that the Security Council, since the beginning of the crisis in Syria, has held 75 official, formal hearings and 97 consultations, 8 meetings using the area formula. It has also adopted 17 resolutions in addition to a number of presidential and press statements on the situation in Syria. However, all this effort has not stopped the support for the world terrorism diaspora from messing with my country, Syria. I would like to remind that the US has used in this council the veto 77 times, Britain 33 times, France 19 times. And the representatives of these countries had no shame when they blocked draft resolutions that simply call for ending the Israeli occupation of our occupied lands and to bring justice to the Palestinian people. It is self-evident that the support programs that the US continue to provide, and these are also provided by regional and Arab countries that are following the paymasters in the region, all the support to the moderate armed group continue to reach the hands of ISIL and the Nusra Front. These are terrorist groups and their affiliates, of course. The Syrian people have the right, and let me say that these countries claim they seek to achieve their interests. They should ask about the logic or the mechanism that govern their approach towards Syria. The US has established a program to train fighters that it has predetermined that they are moderate. And according to US officials, the US has spent $500 million to train 49 fighters. $500 million to train 49 fighters. Most of them took the US-provided weapons, and the moment they reached the Syrian territory, they have joined the terrorist al-Nusra Front. This leaves 5. We have no idea where they are now. The US, Saudi Arabia, Qatar has provided arms and money to the Yarmouk Martyrs Brigade in the south and Al-Julan. This brigade has announced allegiance to ISIL. These countries insisted that the Nordin Zinki organization, it is a terrorist organization supported by Turkey. They insisted that it is moderate despite this organization claiming responsibility for their crimes in Aleppo, and they have actually joined al-Nusra Front after that officially. So all of these moderate armed groups are now affiliated to ISIL. The most recent incident is that the Sukur Jabal Zawiya Brigade, supported by the US, has announced its allegiance to Fath al-Sham Army. That is the new name of the terrorist al-Nusra Front. I would like here to refer to 1,800 electronic messages were deleted from the inbox of the former U.S. Secretary of State that included details on consignments of weapons that were transferred to armed terrorist groups in Syria from Libya through Turkey, and this is by a decision from the American administration. These countries, as they implemented the destructive policies, have relied on a misleading political media campaign to convince the global public opinion that they are fighting terrorism and that the terrorists that they fund, support, harbor, and transfer into Syria from more than 100 states are either moderate opposition or first responders. And they have used white helmets recently as a term, and they have even been nominated to a Nobel Peace Prize. Ladies and gentlemen, here are pictures that shows these moderate members of the opposition, the white helmets, one of them firing an RPG against airplanes. And by the way, he is a physician. A physician in the White Helmets organization firing an RPG against a plane. We have dozens of similar pictures if any of you would like to take a look. And by the way, here I would like to point out that the founder of these malicious white helmets is actually James Le Mesurier, and he is an intelligence officer from Britain. As for the Ron Paul U.S. Institute for Peace and Prosperity has pointed out recently that the Pentagon has paid $540 million US to a British public relations company under the name Bill Pottinger. $540 million, I repeat, paid by the US Pentagon to a British PR company, Bill Pottinger, that provides services usually to Chile and to Saudi Arabia. The purpose of this payment is to create a propaganda that is aggressive to the Syrian government. They fabricate YouTube videos, pictures, and video clips, etc. The United States of America has formed a coalition that enjoys no international coalition under the pretext that they need to fight ISIL and other terrorist organizations that they have since 2003 provided with a fertile ground for the spread. However, the facts on the ground have proven, and since the establishment of this so-called coalition, that ISIL has expanded, gained more ground, and this is because this coalition is not seriously combating terrorism. The contrary is true. The air forces of this coalition has killed hundreds of Syrian military and civilians. It has destroyed infrastructure and economic installation and has provided airdrops with weapons and military supplies to the terrorist organizations to spread more chaos and wreak havoc in the region. However, according to the coalition, all this was just a mistake. Hence, the air forces of the coalition kill civilians, destroys infrastructure, aids terrorists, and arms them. And then they justify their crimes, saying they're simply mistakes that need to be forgiven. And then days after, they repeat the same mistakes. Honestly, one needs now to decipher the strategy of this coalition led by the US. to decipher a code that is based on repeated mistakes. This affirms that it is a systematic, intentional policy, as was the case when their airplanes did target the positions of the Syrian army in Deir Zur. This attack has actually put dozens of civilians in the jeopardy of the ISIL threat. And they even had the audacity to request that safe corridors would be open for the terrorists and to maintain their dignity. Here we ask, did the US, Britain and France open safe humanitarian corridors to protect the moderate terrorists of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, or for those who have committed the massacres of Charlie Hebdo, Bataclan Theater, Nice, California, Boston, Chicago, New York, and London? Why haven't they opened these humanitarian corridors for the escape of terrorists in Europe and the US? The representative of the United States, and I quote, "We must learn from lessons of the past," end of the quote. I would like to tell him, I hope you do that. I wish you can do that. I wish you can learn from your mistakes in Vietnam, Cambodia, Korea, Cuba, Nicaragua, Yugoslavia, and Iraq, and Libya, and Africa. I hope that you would remember, recall, and apologize for what you did to innocent Iraqis. The 408 civilians that you have killed on the 13th of February 1991 in the Amiriya shelter in Baghdad. In the Amiriya shelter in Baghdad. Mr. President, my government reaffirms that it will continue to cooperate with the UN, its agencies and specialized agencies to implement the monthly response plans. And we have approved the October response plan. And I would like to affirm that lack of the full implementation of the response plans is due to the practices of the armed terrorist groups and their allies that continue to obstruct humanitarian access. They continue to loot the assistance and target convoys and humanitarian workers. The most recent attack was targeting the humanitarian assistance convoy that was headed to Oram al-Kubra in rural Aleppo on the 19th of September 2016. This has led to the death of a number of Syrian citizens that are volunteers with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent SARC. They have looted the assistant, burned the trucks. The moderate armed groups have prevented representatives of the SARC from access and providing assistance and delivering this assistance to a number of regions. And these are facts that UN agency workers are well aware of as they work in Syria. We have initiated investigation in the attack against the UN SARC convoy in Oram al-Kubra, and we will provide you with the results of the investigation once concluded. Mr. President, the fact that we are here today in this meeting looking into the situation in eastern Aleppo, as some shed crocodile tears, was a direct result of the US shirking its agreement with the Russian Federation on the 9th of September. It was supposed to be differentiating between the moderate armed groups and another front, and the Syrian Arab Republic government has been committed to the cessation of hostilities agreement, and it has taken the action to implement the provisions and deliver the assistance into Aleppo. However, the fact that the US is not honoring its obligations and the terrorist groups are continuing to violate this agreement, and they are regrouping and launching new attacks, all of this has led to the end of the cessation of hostilities and the deterioration of the situation in Aleppo. after the terrorists have killed 157 Syrian soldiers and 300 civilians in eastern Aleppo. In conclusion, Mr. President, the blood that is spilled in our country is ours. We are the victims of the terrorist war and all its pain, anguish, and torment. It is us and no one else. The pinnacle of hypocrisy and falsification that the sponsors of terrorism would actually shed crocodile tears on the humanitarian crisis. And we will continue to fight terrorism. And this is a parallel track with the commitment to reach a political solution through an intra-Syrian dialogue where Syrians and no one else decide on their future with no foreign intervention. And in conclusion, I would like to call upon those who have shed crocodile tears on the Syrian people. They need to shed genuine tears on 250 Yemenis that were killed today by Western air forces. And these are Western airplanes used by the Saudis. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for that statement. Now the floor goes to the PR of New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm used to the fantastical reveries of the Syrian representative. Very little of what he says can be relied upon as accurate. But when he tells blatant lies about the delivery of humanitarian aid to the Syrian people, I must speak up. The record is clear. The delays in the delivery of humanitarian aid, the removal of medical equipment, and the other obstructions that are put in the place of United Nations convoys, all the responsibility lies very much with the Syrian regime. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I did not want to respond to my colleague because I'm in constant contact with him and I always try to explain to him what is going on in my country and the humanitarian crisis we are facing. However, I did not expect that he would make such a mistake and he would say that I'm a representative of a regime, especially that he is an experienced diplomat, a member of this council. He is supposed to respect international legitimacy and he should address me as the representative of my country, the Syrian Arab Republic. This is the first mistake. The second mistake. It seems that the PR and other colleagues do not read what we send to them. This is a table of 500 letters. 500 letters that we address to you on behalf of the government of my country on terrorism. International, global terrorism sponsored by countries known to all. We have been sending these letters since the beginning of the crisis. 500 letters. It seems that my colleague, the PR of New Zealand, did not read these letters. We have sent 60 letters on the use by terrorists of chemical weapons in Syria. These letters were addressed to you as well. It seems that some of you do not read what we sent to them. Therefore, I urge my colleagues to read these letters because this will definitely help them to see the clear picture of the situation in Syria. Because we in Syria, all of us, have fallen victim to the misunderstanding of some and the misleading lies of others. We, as diplomats, we have the role of dissipating this misunderstanding. We should not lie to one another. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Syria. The meeting is adjourned.